Hi everyone and welcome to my Demon Hunter guide for Season 25 and on. So as you might have seen in the PTR patch notes, this set got a major rework and buff, and it's actually one of the top performing builds in the game now and extremely powerful, especially for Demon Hunter standards. The way this works now is that the sentries got back their auto firing ability that they had back in Season 1, but more importantly they also got the 6 piece damage bonus that they previously didn't have. So they get a 60,000% damage multiplier. They did lose the 400% bonus from the 4-piece, but they also shoot a bit more now. So overall this turns out to be something like a 20 tier buff to the Marauder set. Not only that, but there's also a competition between two different builds on the Marauder set, which is Cluster Arrow and Multishot, which are both performing at pretty much exactly the same level. So you can choose which one to play, and there's even different runes in some cases that you can choose. Especially for Multishot, you can push either with fire or with physical, although farming is mostly only fire. And for Cluster Arrow, you can also push with fire, or you can farm with fire, physical and cold, if you like the rockets. So there's actually lots of really cool setups you can do, and it is also super viable for solo XP farming. It is probably the solo XP farming build for Demon Hunters now, surpassing Shadows and God, and it will also be one of the best DPS for group play and group farming after the Inner Monk for next season. So overall it's looking really good. I expect in Season 25 that with the power of the Soul Shards and the buffed set, Marauder Demon Hunters will be able to do GR150 solo before 2k Paragon most likely. So it's looking extremely good, and let's jump into the setup here. Internally, I've already rewritten the entire Maxwell guide on the Marauder Demon Hunter. This will be updated and pushed to live in a few days from now, but I can already tell you all about it and give you the setups. We have the defeat planner here with a lot of different setups. As I said, there's quite some variety. Here's the non-season stuff. Here's the Season 25 setups with the Soul Shards. I'm gonna go over all of it. Most of the setups revolve around the same things. So we have the 5 pieces of Marauder together with the Ring of Royal Grandeur. We have the Captain Crimson, so we can bind 2 sets. And usually there's a Yang's V-Curve, which is also mandatory for the multi-shot setups, together with the Deadman's Legacy in the cube. We always have the Bombardier's Rucksack, which gives you 2 extra sentries, and also boosts cluster arrow damage for the cluster arrow variations, and also has a whole lot of 100% extra sentry damage. And this sentry damage is actually a multiplier because sentries behave like a pet. So this is extremely powerful. You also want to roll this on your shoulders and on your chest. So a secret is usually in the cube for the extra damage reduction. In certain, especially farming setups, you could go with other options here that give you more speed or more utility, something like a Pride's Fall or Gold Wrap in T16 and these kind of things. But this is usually the way to go here. Tasker and Theo is not really worth it. So Tasker and Theo gives around 25% or so more automatic attacks from your sentries. So without Taskers, they shoot roughly once a second. So for example, here we have Multishot. When you put a sentry, they will shoot it once a second automatically, and with Taskers, something like once every 800 milliseconds. So this is pretty terrible and not really recommended. It is a very slight DPS boost, but most of the damage will actually come from you manually triggering the sentry attacks, because they shoot whenever you do as well. The jewelry can be swapped out. Here is Focus on Restraint and Squirts as the base setup, but you can also play with Endless Walk and the Convention if you like. So these are essentially the two changes you can do. If you don't like to play around Squirts, you can play around Endless Walk and COE, and you can do like more timed bursts with this. So this is basically up to you. Both of them are extremely close, and you can pretty much choose what you like. For your gems, you basically always have the Enforcer, which is a 60% multiplier for your sentries, which produce like 95% of the total damage done or so. You have the Band of Trapped, which is also very powerful. So you have to apply slows. You can do this with your Spider Companion. You get all companions from the 2-piece bonus. So when you have a nuke phase, you press the companion button and the spider will slow everything. Or you have it from the Polar Station. So you can have like one turret somewhere in the middle, while the others are maybe somewhere on the side and shooting into the pull. And this will also proc it. And we have the Zay's Stone of Vengeance. So there is no Bane of the Stricken in this pushing variation of the Fire Multishot and also the Cluster Arrow. The reason for that is that typically your single target damage is actually pretty good, and you have extremely powerful choices here. So the Stricken is not really required, and you rather go for more overall consistent DPS. That being said, there is a physical variation of the Multishot, which doesn't really change very much. You change one passive, you don't need ballistics, which gives you a bonus to rockets, you change the rune on multishot to physical, you change the elements, and you change the stricken. And in this setup, especially when you push very high, you can actually kill the boss slightly faster with this while having roughly similar AoE potential. The thing is that with the fire multishot, it is just much more beginner friendly, so this is probably the variation we're gonna see the most. But for the physical, when you fish very much and you have like a super large density rift, you can actually blast down the AoE, but you cannot really finish off like a few targets because you don't have the rockets that are really strong when you have like 1, 2, or 3 targets or so. In pushing, both of these setups will end up roughly the same, but fire is just easier to play and more consistent, so I'd recommend that for the most part. Another important part here are the passives, so especially custom engineering is basically mandatory for a sentry build. You go from 4 sentries to 5 sentries. This increases your multiplier from your set and also has more sentry to shoot, so this is extremely good. Then we have ambush and call the weak. These are just like DPS passives. They could be swapped out if you feel too squishy, especially numbing traps is a good alternative, which gives you lots of damage reduction. Perfectionist could be used. You could theoretically even go with something like leech, but in Season 25 in particular, this is not really necessary because you have life per hit on your gem anyway. And in the rocket variations, you always go with ballistics. Ballistics is super powerful. You may notice that there's vengeance here, and we don't have a dawn, so you don't actually have 100% vengeance uptime like on most other Demon Hunter builds. Instead, you use it as a DPS cooldown. You can try to stack a bit of cooldown, but typically this is not really a big priority in pushing. So usually you have area damage everywhere, sentry damage, you have the multishot damage here, or cluster arrow for the other setup, and you can do like some flat damage or attack speed and these kind of things. And there's not really much room for cooldown. So it has a rather long cooldown, and you can use it something like once a minute. So this is really some kind of like burst skill in that sense. Other than that, you have the companions, gives you lots of little nice bonuses, and the wolf that you can use as a nuke as well. Gives you the Soil Secret damage reduction, you have vault for the mobility, you have evasive fire for a bit of hatred and to focus and restraint activator, and reverse clarity, and of course you have your multishot. So this is basically the skill setup. Here's a cluster arrow variation, so this works very similar to the multishot. You have essentially all the same stuff, you just change your spender and you change the weapon cube to the manticore. You can still run this with the Yang's V-curve, as I said earlier, with the synergy from the resource cost reduction and the Captain Crimson. That was actually very nice. And this is about it. So you just change the generator and you roll cluster arrow damage on your items and you have the other build. Similar to the multishot build, you can also play with Ender's Walk and Convention again if you like, but you can also play with the Manticore and the Dawn. So if you really want to have this permanent vengeance uptime, you can actually wear the Manticore and then cube the Dawn. And like this, you can go with your typical 37% cooldown reduction, get your permanent vengeance, and this might also help you out a bit with survival when you go with the Dark Heart rune, or with the resources when you go with Thief. So this is also up to you here. Theoretically, you can also play this with Odyssey's End, so you can drop the Dawn again and cube Odyssey's End, and then you just change your generator to Entangling Shot. But this is kind of difficult to do, and again, you lose the permanent vengeance, so you also have a bit of a cost there. But you do get up to 150% additive damage bonus on top, which is extremely good to just nuke down like few targets and the boss, and you can definitely see that stuff is melting once you have thinned out the density a bit. But you have to have very good timing on when you attack with your entangling shots so that the debuff doesn't run out, and you can create like a large chain of monsters that are debuff by this. So this is not really recommended for beginners, but it also seems like a very viable choice. Let's talk about the speed variations a bit. So there is one with fire multishot, and then one with Phys or cold cluster, or one with fire cluster. They work almost exactly the same as in the push anyway. So essentially you mostly just swap out one passive, which is tactical advantage. So usually you drop Cull the Weak because you don't really apply slow to everything in like a speed setup, and you do lose a little bit of damage, but you get a lot of mobility for it. And if you want, you can also try to roll a bit more cooldown reduction, a bit more resource cost reduction instead of all this area damage in particular. And this will help you stay more mobile, set up sentries more often, and you can still run through those waves pretty quickly. The same with the cluster arrow. So here's the rocket variations. So either physical or cold, you just have to change the element and the rune. Aside from this, the same thing. We have tactical advantage, we have all the same stuff here, and you have ballistics of course because there's rockets from this cluster arrow. And the same with the fire cluster. This is probably the one that I would recommend for group speeds. So if you're playing with 2 supports and 2 demon hunters or something like that, I would probably go with this. But it seems fine to also go with the multi-shot. It seems fine to also go with this. So there's not really much of a change between the different builds here anyway. And finally in T16, you don't really care much about the sentries. You just set them up somewhere in the corner for the buff, and you run around one-shotting everything yourself with multi-shot. So you just go really fast here. We also swap out some gems, boot the hoarder, there's a powerful. You just rush through. You can take preparation, focus mind for extra discipline for vaulting, and you should have no trouble with destroying T16 with this. Now, one note for the soul shards in Season 25 in particular. So in case you're seeing this after Season 25, you can skip this part. So we have the Sliver of Terror in the helm. We want to go with the attack speed and critical hit chance variation of it. So in case you're not aware, there are 3 different variations. One is the Ring of Fire after 100 enemies. There is the attack speed and crit, and here is increased lightning and fire damage. You might be tempted to go with this one because you deal fire damage, but the better choice is actually this, because it's straight up just more DPS when you have at least 3 skills on cooldown. This also means that you generally want to face roll your cooldowns, so even when you have Vengeance as kind of like a DPS skill in your setup, you should consider just pressing it on cooldown all the time, because you get more damage buffs and more damage reduction from this Helm Shard. For your weapon shard, you have direct supplies, then typically you want to go fire skill damage here, but it is fine to go with percent damage as well. So it can roll up to 50% local damage increase for your weapon, which is almost as good as fire. So if you get one or the other, then yeah, just try to get this, but it's fine. And you also want to get the secondary effect where your pets stack up damage up to 100% extra stacks. And then you can use this a little bit as a burst phase sometimes. So if you keep an eye on your buff bar, you can actually see this stacking up and then dropping down again and stacking up again. So you can influence this a little bit by shooting manually at the right moment. So for example, when you play a COE version, you can try to slowly stack it or not let it reach 100 right before your COE, and then in COE you start blasting, and then you're at the peak and it will slowly drop down again, and you can actually get a bit more out of it. Those soul shards stay pretty much the same in all the different variations besides T16, where you just don't need the damage very much and you actually focus on, not on your pet damage but on your own. So you can go for an Essence of Anguish here with extra speed or the Death Blow Explosion, and you can go for Shard of Hatred here for the extra 50% movement speed. So this is a bit up to you, but I would recommend those here. Now those were a lot of different setups, but I want to include them all here. We have actually this amazing variety with 2 different builds with even different versions of them in one build now, and I'm actually quite pumped to play this myself, and I hope you are too. As for the general playstyle, you need to be aware that without sentries you're not dealing damage now. So the sentries do most of it, and you also need to set them up to even get the damage buff to begin with. So when you start a run, you always have to make sure that you set up some sentries quickly, especially when there's enemies right away somewhere at the start. You want to make a pull, set up the sentries, blast them down. So it has kind of a little bit of a ramp time, but with a bit of cooldown reduction that you typically get from the Helm Gem, Paragon, Crimson, etc., it won't really take that long. Similarly, in case you die on softcore, you also have this situation where your damage is just a bit weak early on, because you can set up a maximum of 3 sentries at once and then you have to wait for 2 more recharges. So you also don't really blast down the density very much. So you also gotta be careful and really avoid dying. So this is quite important. Now the positioning of the sentries matters a lot for this build, and it's actually different requirements depending on which setup you play. So when you play multi-shot, typically you want to put them somewhere in a corner or at the side of the map or something like that, and make a pull in front of them, and make sure that you kite enemies around there and have them all aggroed to your pets or you or your follower, and not let your sentries get distracted by this one little enemy. They always attack the closest enemy, so you need to make sure that they are actually like facing the right direction towards the most of the pull, because they have this cone-shaped AoE. So they can easily miss most targets if they are distracted to one side. Especially in pushing, the positioning is very important, because you usually fight for quite a while in the same spot. So you want to make sure that you chose the right place. Additionally, you also want to slow the pull. So typically you want to have like 1 sentry somewhere in the middle. So even if that is not really like in the perfect spot to hit most targets, you will apply the polar station slow to everything, and this will give you more damage because of the benefit trapped and the color weak. Now for the cluster arrow builds, this positioning requirement is basically reversed. So instead of setting them up somewhere on the side so they can shoot into the pool, you set them up exactly in the middle of the pool. because this cluster arrow has a rather small AoE and you want to make sure to hit the most targets. So we want to make a large pull and then set up the sentries in the middle and just let them blast their way through the core of the pool, so to say, and slowly let more monsters walk in and then let them all get blasted as well. Both of these setups have their own little details that you need to learn. One good part about especially the fire multishot and the rocket cluster variations is that the rockets don't actually care about the direction they're facing. They just like fly around and hit something. They're like homing in, so that especially for fire multishot it matters a little bit less where you position your sentries compared to, for example, the physical multishot variation where all of the damage comes from the cone-shaped AoE, so you gotta be more careful there. One neat part about cluster arrow is that cluster arrow actually has an infinite range when shot from sentries. So especially when you're farming, you don't actually have to set up new sentries all the time. So you gotta be a bit aware of the map layout and where your sentries are, because as long as there's a line of sight unbroken between the sentries and the target, it will just come in from like 5 screens away and blast down everything. You can really use it to your advantage when you're farming with cluster arrow, and especially in those big open maps with like long straight paths, you can try to set them up somewhere at like a crossroad or somewhere where you know you're gonna run to one direction for a while, like a sewer for example, and this actually allows you to deal more damage in those maps. But it's actually quite curious, and you can really feel like there's reinforcements coming in and just obliterating everything when you're speed farming, while in other maps you might have like your 1 or 2 sentries set up somewhere in the next room and it might take a little bit longer. So you kind of have to decide for yourself where's the sweet spot where you can deal with like hard enemies with only a few sentries, versus where sometimes you just blast down everything with like 5 sentries shooting from somewhere. But in general, when you're farming with these sentry builds, you do rely on the sentries, so you want to make sure that you set up sentries often, and especially have to think about a bit like when do you set them up if you really want to optimize it. So you can go at a pace of something like 3 minutes per run, very efficiently, very high levels, but you need to be careful about your sentry placement, especially with the multishot variation. And with this, I conclude this guide. So personally, I can say that I had a lot of fun playing this on the PTR. It is a powerhouse of a build now, so demon hunters can really rejoice, I believe. And it's just gonna be really cool to play around with the different variations of that. And with this, I conclude the guide. So hope you enjoyed it. And personally, I can say that I had a lot of fun playing this on the PTR, and I'm really looking forward to season 25, trying this out. And it's gonna stay a powerhouse of a build for the demon hunters. So I believe it's gonna be here for a long time as one of the top builds. And potentially with Inner's Monk nerf coming, this might actually turn out to be one of the best sellers to play in the future as well. So I hope you enjoyed this guide, have fun in season 25, and I'll see you guys next time.